Hello. Welcome to another episode of The Horrific Podcast. We're two friends who live in different places but share a love for scary movies. Each week we both watch the same movie on our own and then record a conversation together about what we liked, what we hated, if we were scared, and maybe even some larger truths about why people watch horror movies in the first place. This season we're going to be focusing on horror subgenres and how they've changed over time. Hope you enjoy it, and thanks for listening. All right, we're back. This season, we're doing a collection of miniseries on different subgenres of horror movies. And this is week 2 of our deep dive on monster movies. Last week, we started off with King Kong, and this week, we're back with another movie that might have had some similarities. Let me describe something for you, and then you can answer my question at the end. It's a movie about a giant-sized version of an animal. It involved human activity getting him out of his natural habitat and into a densely populated area, and was a movie that spawned a franchise that has lasted for decades.
Yep. You're talking about the Hulk?
Right. Yeah, it's King Kong, but who else? It's our homeboy Godzilla.
That's true. Hell yeah, man. Hey, if I could, I would make the Godzilla roar right now.
Yeah. Had you seen this one before?
It's just like with King Kong, where like I feel like the whole movie, but in bits and pieces. I hadn't sat down start to finish yet, or before. So
I have a confession to make. I was like quite sure that I had seen this movie, but I definitely hadn't. I have seen at least parts of a ton of Godzilla movies over the years, but there were scenes in this one that I definitely had not seen before.
Yeah.
And so that kind of grabbed my attention early on because it did not feel nearly as familiar as I expected it to.
So very similar. I was wondering, I know when we were doing King Kong, they added like a couple of those scenes that were cut out because of the intensity.
Yeah.
So I wonder if that was like why I didn't remember some of them.
Yeah. I think that one thing that stood out to me a lot about this one was how different it was, at least in my mind, from future Godzilla movies. Because in the future movies, he is almost always fighting another big monster. And that's a different type of movie because he's almost seen as like the protector of Japan. Whereas in this one, he was just the monster attacking Japan. And I think that almost makes this a more unique or more fitted example of the monster horror genre than any of the other ones would be. So I'm glad that we watched this one, and it gave me a little bit of a different view of Godzilla than I think what I had from watching the movies that came after this one a lot more.
Yeah.
But yeah, we've done some giant monster movies from the 50s before, and a lot of them involve nuclear technology in one way or another, and this one's no exception. But I had the story quite different in my mind. I always thought Godzilla was a lizard that just got big because of nukes. But it turns out the nuke test just pissed him off, but also kind of contaminated him. So there's a lot to get into here, but I really enjoyed going back to this one because I learned a lot of things that I didn't realize I didn't know.
Yeah. I mean, first off, like, you talk about like iconic monster movies. Like, we just hit 1 and 2, I feel like.
Yeah,
and
for sure.
Just being able to like, here's the thing too, like watching movies, it's sometimes the atmosphere that you're in. So if you go to theater, it's, sometimes you might enjoy a movie a little bit more, whatever the case. When I was watching both King Kong and Godzilla, it was like pouring down outside. And so during the day, it was like dark, and so like it was just like I was cozy watching it, and I was like in heaven. So there are definitely pieces that I had to rewatch because I dozed off because I was so comfortable. But there's something about these that is just like, it's it's almost like, eating, your parents' home cooking when you come back from college or something. You just feel like I'm at home. Yeah. And that's what I kind of felt watching these, even though I hadn't sat there and watched it nonstop. It's just what we enjoyed previously. So yeah, I was on board already with it and excited to watch it. But then once I realized, like, oh yeah, you haven't actually watched this all the way through, it was exciting, I guess is where I'm getting at.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I enjoyed revisiting this one as well. I'll do an introduction, and then you can do some fun facts, and then we will get into the ancient legend, fire, nuclear breath, oversized lizard destroying people and toys details. In 1954, Toto Co. brought us Godzilla, a Japanese giant reptile monster movie. It tells the story of a giant monster that emerges from the depths of the sea and terrorizes the people of Japan. As the damage spreads and the creature's body count grows, a scientist must make a difficult choice about a weapon he has discovered. This movie was made on a budget of 100 million yen and made almost $3 million at the box office. It can currently be streamed on HBO Max. What did you learn about this movie?
So there are a few things that were similar to like King Kong. He was kind of talking about like how they made the sound for like the roar that you hear with Godzilla. Supposedly with this one, so like with King Kong, they like mixed, I think they were saying like multiple animals like tiger and lion, maybe a bear, I don't know, combo. And that's how they got that sound. With this one, it was they produced that roar by for King Kong, they did those animals and then combined them and then played it backwards or something like that. With this one, they got by rubbing pine tar coated leather gloves over a double bass string. So that's a double bass instrument. And so that's how they got it. Have you heard about how the original name for Godzilla? Have you heard what that was going to be?
No, I know that Gojira is what was written originally in Japan, but I don't know the story behind it or anything.
Yeah, so that was rumored to be the name, or rumored that was a nickname of a quote unquote tough guy at the Toho Studios where the film was made. So according to Mr. Honda, who directed the first Godzilla film, there was a big, this is the quote, there was a big, I mean huge fellow working in the Toho department, publicity department, and other employees would say that guy is as big as a gorilla. No, he's almost as big as Kujira, which is the Japanese word for whale. And over time, the two got mixed together and they came up with the name, that's where the name Gojira comes from, Gojira.
So just blatant bullying and body shaming.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. I love it even more because of that. Last thing, the actor who played Godzilla was tough, I guess. There was originally two actors who took on the role of the radioactive lizard. Actor Haru took the brunt of the work in the suit. He studied animal movement in order to get into character, but wearing the suit didn't come without any issues. The suit was obviously super heavy. He ended up only being able to wear it for less than 10 minutes. It also caused him to get many burns and sores, and he became so sweaty that they needed to pour out his sweat between takes. And that's the facts that I want to get into.
So it's interesting that you talked about the music not being the thing that caused it not to seem intense. I think that if I did the math right, which is no guarantee, I'd say there's a small chance this is even in the right ballpark, but I think that based on what I looked up, 100 million yen in 1954 would have converted to about $275,000 in U.S. currency. It's hard to draw an exact equivalency between technology levels and access to movie making stuff, because that, especially like early on in the 1900s, it was really skewed by the U.S. having Hollywood and like having a big market for that stuff and like used cameras and access to the tools of movie making. But Kong was made on a budget of $670,000 in 1933. So comparatively, this was a very, very, very low budget movie. And one of the things we talked about last week was how you kind of had to cut these movies some slack because they were doing a lot of things on screen for the first time, and it doesn't necessarily have the same impact today. to watch it. But like thinking about when Photoshop was new and we all immediately believed a lot of unrealistic pictures, you know, the scenes here with the toys were real hard to take seriously in 2023. But some of that may have been much less goofy when it was released in 1950.
Yeah, I think I can't remember what film we were just talking about. We were just talking about a film not too long ago about the experience that the viewers had at the theater. Gosh, I don't remember, but basically it made me think like, okay, maybe people did actually pass out back in the day at the movie theater when they were watching this, because it was like intense. So at this point, it's like, yeah, I mean, like I think watching these older films, I kind of have a different perspective of like, well, I guess in the 50s they had seen something like this before, but it's still like at the end of the day, we're doing this for our horror podcast. Like it's still like an action film, like action packed, I guess is what you would call it. Maybe a 1950s action film, which has a lot of talking.
Yeah. There were definitely long stretches of not Godzilla in this movie, which were not its strong suits in my opinion. But
yeah, but it was still okay, because like I think a lot of this as well is kind of like when it comes to like with the haunted houses of like what makes them stay. Like there are different aspects to it, and a lot of that could have answered was answered. I felt like for like in the talking scenes that we had with this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. And even though it was like lower budget, I do think that this one did a lot of things for the first time. Like the whole idea of like the guy in a suit kicking over miniatures and stuff. Some of the things about the filming technique and the way they made it were pretty new and innovative, but also like very cost effective, which I think is cool.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that it even goes back to, I think you and I both tend to be more fans of practical effects than digital effects. And this one was about as practical as you could get.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, like even when I was doing the research and like seeing the suit and all that, like what they had to wear and or what they wore for it, like I don't know, it's just something exciting about it.
Yeah. So high level, this movie, H-bomb testing set free a giant ancient monster from under the sea, and it starts attacking cities across Japan. The government, military, whatever, try increasingly powerful things to stop him, but nothing works or really even slows him down. In the end, a scientist who had discovered a new superweapon agrees to use it against Godzilla, but he destroys all his research so it can never be used again before he uses the weapon and finally wins. That, like I said, is not what I remembered the general storyline of this being. So that was interesting to me on a lot of levels. But there are some things that we talked about last time that we're going to be paying attention to as we watch these monster movies for the next few weeks. And the first one I wanted to get into was like, what is the type of monster and how does that affect the way the horror in the movie is managed? And like, what makes the monster dangerous or hard to stop? And like Kong, Godzilla was a really, really big version of a thing that we mostly know about, which is like a lizard or a dinosaur. And that's inherently a problem because he's destructive just by walking around. Like just merely being in the vicinity of people, he's a danger to people. But they also really upped the intensity on this one by adding the features of him being nuclear and also having fire breath.
Yeah,
so
nuclear breath.
Yeah, so just like the scope of his potential damage is on a whole different scale than what Kong's was. And to me, that meant that this movie was a lot more like action and destruction than it was like suspense or trying to figure out, how they were. It was almost like, when is he going to strike next? And what are we going to try this time? And it's not going to work. And it's getting more and more desperate as the movie goes along, more so than like the suspense of who's the killer or, am I as one individual going to get trapped in the house with a ghost or something?
Yeah. Yeah. This is like apocalyptic horror, in a way where like it the world because of like even the nuclear powers that Godzilla had in this. So yeah, I mean, in a way, I feel like this it should technically be even more scary than like a haunted house.
Yeah. And another thing that we talked about was kind of like, there has to be a sense of urgency. Like, why don't the characters you care about just run away from the situation?
Yeah.
And I think Godzilla's mobility was a big part in this one.
Yeah.
Because in King Kong, you know, he really wasn't that big of a danger to most people until they took him out of his environment and brought him back to New York.
Mm-hmm.
But with Godzilla, it's like, yeah, he's just like making his way around this island, attacking at random. And you never really knew where he was going to strike next. So it wasn't like you could just go visit your family on the other side of Japan. It was like the whole country was sort of in existential danger.
Yeah.
And I think that it also did an interesting job of like managing the sense of urgency by the fact that they kept preparing for him, and then he would show up, and then all their plans would just immediately go out the window because they weren't effective. Mm-hmm. And so it's just like, oh crap, what more can we do? You know, we keep trying different things and none of them are working. And that was almost like building a sense of dread about it that I think was an interesting element to add to this one that wasn't as much in Godzilla.
Yeah,
or,
that's
King Kong.
That's actually a good point, the sense of dread. Because if 90% of the things you try are failing, what are you going to do? And also, like, you know, in time with kind of, you know, the first question, like what type of monster and how does it affect a horror? Like my thing is like, you know, with King Kong, if you think about it, the safest place is probably like in the middle of the ocean. You know, like there's like the point like in the ocean that is like furthest from anything, like furthest from land. I don't know what they call that point. Mm-hmm. That's like the safest point because you're like, I don't think this dude's gonna make it that far. Yeah, he's right. A gorilla. This lizard, like this, what they're, you know, like what's safe? They're huge. Yeah. They're smashing everything. Like, what's the safe place for this? And it's not the water, isn't, you know, like you can't run. Like it is just a constant terror, you know, if that were to happen in real life.
Yeah. And I think one thing that really stood out to me too with this one as being different than King Kong is in Kong, he didn't show up. You didn't see King Kong for the first time until like roughly halfway through the movie. Mm-hmm. Whereas in this one, you saw Godzilla 20 minutes into this thing. Like they were ready to get down to business. Mm-hmm. And the way that they managed kind of the pace and the tone, it was just a totally different take, which I think was interesting as far as, you know, maybe that's one reason that this one really stands out because it didn't feel like a knockoff of King Kong. It felt like its own type of thing to me.
Yeah. Yeah. It definitely did. Like you could tell, you can definitely tell that there's influences, but I think the idea itself was very original. Yeah. And unfortunate how they kind of had to come up with that, you know, but that's neither here nor there, I guess.
Yeah. Another thing that stood out to me as being different was just answering the question of how do they make you feel sympathy for the monster. That was really not nearly as big a plot point in this one, I don't think, because there was no time where like the people overcame Godzilla and then like tried to exploit him. You know what I mean? Like he was pretty solidly in control of the situation for the whole movie up until the last few minutes. But I guess you could say he was like minding his own business until the hydrogen bomb testing affected him. So maybe there's that angle, and there's the guy that keeps talking about how they should be studying Godzilla instead of fighting him, and how like he could actually be the key to, you know, the survival of humanity in the nuclear age and stuff like that. And I think that this whole movie really was kind of social commentary on nuclear weapons and man's creation of, you know, these more and more powerful forces that they're harnessing against each other, and how like ultimately we should be defending all of mankind maybe instead of, you know, fighting each other and stuff like that. So it was almost like they were trying to use to some extent Godzilla as a metaphor for all of that. And I think that it was more like his metaphorical value that sort of made you see like a different side of him than because he was like, you know, protecting one of the protagonists or being exploited by the people. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely does. Like, where King Kong was almost like like the exploit for money or whatever the case. This one was just like, I'm here for destruction, but because of the reasoning that they made this, the reasoning where the inspiration came from was just straight destruction. Like, I understand the connection between this two, like, for sure.
Well, yeah, and it was like the nuclear weapons kind of created Godzilla or brought him into the picture to some extent, and it's like, well, we let this thing out, and now it's coming back to hurt us. And I think that metaphorical piece of it, it's almost like he feels almost like a reflection of things that people did coming back to them than he does like him being particularly malevolent or anything. But then another thing that I think is interesting to talk about is just like what ends up being the key to victory. And with King Kong, it was a pretty simple answer. It was airplanes with machine guns. And
damn right.
Like we talked about last week, that was one thing the director commented on was you have this person who's sort of like at the top of the food chain in this more primitive world who then comes into modern civilization and is just kind of immediately dispatched by modern technology. And that's kind of the commentary that they were going for. With Godzilla, it was different because it was the fictional oxygen destroyer weapon that was like this one step beyond what man has ever achieved currently, that is the only thing that can stop him. And you could say that is, sort of symbolic of how, like, in any type of arms race, if somebody doesn't just put an end to it, we're just going to keep coming up with more and more efficient ways of killing each other. But it was interesting to me, I guess, that in this one, it was really science was what won. So, like, in King Kong, it was really more like civilization and, like, the army. Like, the army saved humanity. And then with Godzilla, it was like, oh, the scientist saved humanity. And that really, to me, reflects a lot about the times, like a movie made in 1933 versus a movie made in 1954, when we were sort of like in the nuclear age and scientific breakthroughs and everything that came along with that. So I don't really know where I'm going with that. I just thought it was interesting the way that, like, the key to victory, or like the way that society gets past the danger, is like sort of the thing that's at the top of society at the time.
Right. Well, I mean, and something that I think is really important about what you're saying is, like, at the time, especially in 1954, it's not like we knew as much about, anything nuclear as we do now. And, like, even in 1954, there were nuclear bombs tests happening. So the year this film came out, that, like, kind of poisoned some waters and got a whole bunch of people sick. And that was the same year this film came out. So, like, I definitely liked the scientific, like, resolution to this problem, because at the time it's like they had to have been doing that in science anyways, trying to figure out, like, why is this nuclear giving, like, everyone radiation sickness, and the fallout is like making people sick, or like fish are dying. Like, they had to figure that out, obviously. Like, well, they just tested a nuclear bomb, that's going to happen. But I understand for the situation at the time they're in.
Yeah. There was one other thing that I think was maybe kind of a reflection of the times, in that, like, newspapers and public opinion seemed to play a really big part in this movie. One, in, like, how they were telling the story, but also in sort of reflecting people's reactions to it and the danger, and kind of building that sense of dread. And that's a thing that I feel like we see all the time in movies now, is like newspaper headlines as a way of advancing the plot, or kind of signaling to you, like, how you're supposed to feel about a thing. Yeah. But this is one of the older ones that I remember that really jumped in on that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah. Outside of all of that, the only other thing in my notes that I really wanted to bring up was there was one scene where Godzilla is attacking, and he starts using his, like, it was almost like when he first really revealed his nuclear fire breath. Mm-hmm. And there were just all these shots of, like, everything on fire. And I feel like that was happening on a scale that was hard to do in movies at the time. And they got around it by, like, obviously using miniatures. So it was like cost effective to just burn it all down. But the idea of him like walking around the city and everything being on fire and all of that, I just thought was a really, really striking visual for the time that stood out to me as a much more like visceral thing than anything that was in King Kong by far.
There is a ton of work, in the CGI and doing all that. But like this is like you're putting your hands, you're doing it with your hands. And, I definitely have always respect that. So I definitely appreciate the concept and how they did it. I know King Kong and a billion other monster movies did the similar thing, but there's just something about that always kind of gets a pass if it's an old film.
Yeah, it's just kind of part of the whole package of the way that the movie is presented that works for us both, I think.
At the end of the day, I was stoked we did this. Like, I'm glad we went to Godzilla. Is it horror? Maybe not my style. I think it is horrific. The things that, like the destruction and things that happen. But like, did I get like the haunted house, fright feeling, or like the home invasion ones? No, not technically, but I consider this like horror action. And so it's like, I'm in. Like, this is still scary. The concept itself, if it was real life, would be terrifying. And, it's old, so I like it.
Well, yeah, and I think that's what we're finding with these movies is like the monster horror subgenre leads to a different type of movie than what a lot of the horror movies that we've talked about in the past are. And especially the giant monster horror subgenre. Like it uses different techniques to try and create the feelings that horror movies give you. And I think one thing that we really got into with this one is like that sense of dread and the way that they build that over the course of the movie. That's kind of it's just the way that it's done and the way that you feel about it is different than watching like a slasher. Yeah.
Yeah. And like I was saying in the King Kong episode, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact of this is affecting a ton of people. Like, this is affecting, could be worldwide or even a full nation. Whereas, the
scale is almost overwhelming.
It's very overwhelming. Yeah. And the scale of deaths for, slashers are generally a lot lower. It's the same concept with like zombies, Yeah.
That kind of apocalyptic breakdown of society type thing.
Well, it's like, no matter what, after the dust clears, so no matter what happens, the world is still going to be different after Godzilla is gone or whatever. But like, at the end of the day, so let's use Halloween as an example, just for real life. It's an unfortunate thing, but it's not like the world is going to change completely.
Right.
World would change 1000% with a King Kong or Godzilla,
Yeah. And so talking about kind of the type of horror and the scale and how it works and how it tries to make you feel, I do feel like we should point out that this movie is real different than a lot of the sequels. So in this one, Godzilla functions much like King Kong did in his movie, in that there's this one giant monster that mankind is trying to overcome. What changes in future ones is that Godzilla is fighting another big monster, and it creates kind of the same situation where, the societal impacts, the destruction is all still there. But I feel like in those, they almost lean more into getting you on the side of Godzilla, almost as like a protector. And that changes, for me at least, the type of horror. Because it's like, I feel empathy for this giant creature that could destroy me, but is also my only hope at survival. And I think that feeling is really key to what ended up being a big tradition of like crossover in monster movies. But that's something that we're going to be back to talk about next week.
Yes, sir. I think that it's interesting. It's almost like a superhero in a way, like what kind of Godzilla turned into.
Or like an anti-hero,
Well, I was going to say, there was, when I was doing some facts, I was reading about how there was comic books for Godzilla versus Batman. Yeah. And they were going to like make a movie or something out of it. I didn't go too in deep, but it's like boy, it's like the anti-hero versus the anti-hero, kind
Yeah,
of
no
thing.
joke. That's amazing.
Yeah. But it, the thing is like, if you got it, might as well. Like, I think that's one of the reasons why, I think if this was just a standalone film, it wouldn't be as legendary as it is,
Yeah, that was a thought that I did have, was I think Godzilla in the future movies is much more the one that people remember and like are excited about and cheer for, not the one in this one, because he was just kind of a destructive jerk.
Exactly. Yeah.
But yeah, that was Godzilla. We're going to be back. We're going to be digging more into monsters for the next couple of weeks, and we hope that you'll join us.
Yes, sir.
And that's it for today's episode. If you've listened this far, then thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed it. We're always looking for new ideas, so if you have any questions, comments, or movie suggestions, please send us an email at thehorrificpod@gmail.com, or feel free to comment on or message our Facebook page. Just search for The Horrific Podcast. Thanks for listening.